Welcome to the Naval War College, the Navy's home of thought. We are excited to present a new series titled NWC Talks, where we showcase our world-class experts in discussing national security matters. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
We hear a lot of talk these days about the national security deep state. But is that even a real thing? My name is David Cooper, the James V. Forrestal Professor of National Security Affairs. And I'd like to talk to you today about the real deep state. And by the real deep state, I mean the permanent career bureaucracy. Bureaucratic politics, not at the high level of government, but at subordinate levels. This idea of the deep state is not new. It's a term that's been out there for a while. It just hasn't been used to apply to a country like the United States. Traditionally, when we talk about a national security deep state, we're talking about countries that have a weak or fragile democracy and powerful security organs, both external and internal. And therefore, these are countries where, although there's the veneer of democracy, the security organs may not be responsive to the democratically elected leaders. These are countries such as Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, and other countries have traditionally been thought of in this way, but not a democracy like the United States. When people talk about the deep state currently, what are they talking about? If they're talking about a vast, permanent, and influential national security bureaucracy, then that is an important topic. That's a reality. That's a real thing. And in fact, that's probably something that has not been studied or understood enough. However, a lot of talk of deep state these days is very loose and often refers to things that really don't make sense to think of as a deep state, as a permanent, entrenched bureaucracy that is unresponsive to democratically elected leaders. So what I'd like to do is talk about not only what the deep state is, but what the deep state isn't. Let's start with what the deep state most certainly isn't. The deep state is not political opposition. People like Nancy Pelosi or former Obama administration political appointees who criticized the Trump administration, that's not the deep state. Remember back in the 1990s when then First Lady Hillary Clinton said that there was a vast right-wing conspiracy against her husband, President Bill Clinton? Was she right? Well, sure she was, in the sense of there was organized political opposition to him. Ditto President Trump. Congress, as a co-equal branch of government, is not the deep state. In fact, Congress and political oversight and the fact that officials from former administrations have come into government and then left government and are now criticizing those who have come in government after, none of that is the deep state. That's actually not a deep state undermining democracy. That is democracy. Another thing that the deep state is not is White House intrigue, the sort of palace politics that we see in every administration and certainly in the current Trump administration. The fact of the matter is that these are the president's political appointees. They serve at the president's pleasure. They can be fired and are often fired by the president. And in any case, they came with the president and they will leave with the president. So again, this is not the deep state in any traditional understanding of that term. As a matter of fact, there's a certain irony to thinking of presidential political appointees as part of the deep state. And that irony is our entire system of having thousands and thousands of presidential political appointees, temporary officials who are dispersed throughout the government at the highest levels, but all the way down to relatively low levels. That's in fact a system designed to prevent an unresponsive career bureaucracy by putting political overseers, political masters, right down there into the bureaucratic trenches. And our country is almost unique in the extent of this putting political appointees deep within the line government. Compared to parliamentary democracies such as Great Britain, we have a very shallow, not a very deep state in this sense. One of the challenges, if you look at the role of the deep state, is that it doesn't play a very prominent role in high-level decision-making. If you look at sort of a pyramid chart of a typical agency, like the Department of Defense or the Department of State, what you'll see is at every level, down to the very lowest levels, it's political appointees and not career officials who are the dominant presence. If you look at a similar pyramid chart of the interagency process, where the White House brings agencies together to work out and coordinate among agencies, that too is dominated by political appointees really all the way down to the lowest levels of that process. So in terms of the decision-making processes, both within agencies and between agencies, this really is not a process that the permanent career bureaucracy dominates. It's really a process dominated by temporary political appointees, those who've come with the president and will leave with the president. And that's the difference between traditional understanding of bureaucratic politics and what I call subordinate bureaucratic politics. In traditional bureaucratic politics, what we think of is agency leaders fighting each other, bargaining and jockeying together, not for the abstract national interest, but for their own agency's organizational bureaucratic interests. So if the State Department has a diplomatic proposal that they think will do diplomatic good, but that the Defense Department will be hurt by in some way, then bureaucratic politics tells us that probably the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense will not be in agreement and will either need to come up with some compromise between themselves or refer it up to higher levels to the president to resolve their differences. So bureaucratic politics, as we traditionally understand it, is all about the clash and the bargaining between leaders of the various agencies and their effort to work things out between the things that affect their agency's interests. At lower levels, it's not the agency's overall interests that are in play. It's the very narrow, specific interests for which lower level officials are responsible. And this makes for a very different type of bargaining, a very different type of interaction. Let me give you some examples. For instance, if you have officials who are responsible for issues like human rights or religious freedom, and you have other officials who are responsible for things like counter-narcotics or counter-terrorism, these are all important issues. These are all part of the national interest. And let's assume that all these officials happen to be working in the Department of State. These are all important State Department issues. But chances are that those officials will be in two sets of coalitions that are frequently at loggerheads. Why? Because the governments that those working counter-proliferation and counter-narcotics need to work with in order to be effective at their mission are sometimes governments that do not have stellar records on things like human rights and religious freedom. Therefore, these officials are going to be working at counter purposes, and they will need to bargain and jockey in order to sort that out. What's interesting is that means that at subordinate levels of bureaucratic politics, down where the real deep state lives, this bargaining isn't just between agencies, it's often within agencies and within coalitions of officials between agencies. Let me give you another example. Let's assume that there is a big summit coming up with Pakistan. Well, you're going to have a group of regional officials who are responsible for our relationship with Pakistan, a very important and delicate relationship. And they are going to want that summit to be a success. They are going to be looking for things to promote a good outcome of that summit. But now you have another set of officials, and they're responsible for nuclear proliferation. Well, for those officials, Pakistan is a problem. They are a country of proliferation concern. So these officials are going to have fundamentally different cross purposes as they try to tee up what we want to get out of this summit with Pakistan. And that raises a very common feature of subordinate bureaucratic politics, and that is the cleavage between functional, meaning officials responsible for things on a global remit, counter-narcotics, non-proliferation, human rights, and so forth, and regional officials, those who are responsible for relations with a country like Pakistan or a region like South Asia. Frequently, those officials will be at cross purposes with each other. Another feature at the lower levels, the permanent career bureaucracy, is there are communities, the policy community, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community. And they have not only different roles, but very different cultures. So, the policy community, for example, is well used to working on very politically charged issues and directly with political appointees. However, the law enforcement and the intelligence communities have a strong tradition of being apolitical, and therefore are likely to fiercely resist anything that they perceive as undue political influence. So is this a deep state resisting the democratic leaders? Well, it depends on your perspective. We in our country have had a long norm in terms of our national security apparatus of having an independent law enforcement and an independent intelligence community with minimized political influence. So in that sense, that may be the case, certainly far more than the policy community. I hope what you're taking away from this is the idea that there is a real deep state, in the sense of the permanent bureaucracy has grown significantly over the last half century, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of numbers of agencies. Whereas it used to be the big two, state and defense, now for any given issue, state and defense certainly, but also departments such as Homeland Security, Commerce, Treasury, even Health and Human Services or agriculture. That means that there are a lot more conversations going on at a lot more tables with a lot more specialized interests in play. And this is something that, again, as I said at the outset, this is important. It's probably not appreciated or understood, certainly by academic analysts, but it is far from a sinister, organized conspiracy. In fact, what it is the opposite of organized. It is a sprawling and freewheeling bureaucracy with officials who are civil servants who are trying to promote the issues for which they have been given specific responsibility, and in the scrum with other officials who are doing the same thing on issues that may or may not align. So it's big, it's sprawling, it's messy, and it's real, but it is not political opposition. It is not the president's inner circle and palace politics intrigue in the White House. And most of all, it is not an organized entity. It is, in fact, a sprawling bureaucracy. Thank you very much. This is David Cooper, and this has been NWC Talks.